Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us this morning. Apologies for the slightly delayed start. We were having some technical difficulties on the back end here, which is, I think, just speaks volumes to the year 2020. Being resilient, flexible, being able to handle things on the fly. So we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. Really happy to have Paul Browning here with us from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He is the president and CEO of Mitsubishi Power Americas, and he and I were just chatting briefly in the dead time before we got started about everything that he does, and it's really fascinating. I think he's going to bring a lot of really interesting insight into the discussion around decarbonization and what it takes to do it at a global scale. There's certainly a lot of challenges and opportunities in play. I think we're going to hear a lot about hydrogen, which is the fuel of 2020. I think its importance for meeting various decarbonization goals has really risen to the forefront of a lot of discussions, particularly in the power sector, but also in heavy industry over the course of 2020. So without a doubt, the year has been one of highlighting various ways to transition, not just in the energy space, but also in the way we go about doing our daily tasks, including what you're seeing right now, this sort of virtual setting. So I think, is Rachel on with us now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna hand it over to Rachel Meidl. Rachel Meidl is a fellow in energy and environment at the Baker Institute. Most of you have probably seen her many times on other webinars. She does a lot of work related to sustainability. And I think she's a perfect choice to sort of lead this conversation with Paul. And I'm going to pass it over to the two of you and look forward to a fantastic discussion.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Ken, for that introduction. Paul, it's wonderful to have you here with us, and everybody that's tuning in. I really appreciate your patience. That technical difficulty, that hiccup was on my end. My speakers on my computer decided to blow out today. So anyway, I swapped out laptops, and we're ready to go here. So thanks everybody for tuning in to what will be a really enlightening conversation, with Paul. And for those of you that are watching, please submit your questions into the Q&A section, and we will address those as we go. And I think we are carving out some time at the end as well for some Q&A. And I think we still have we have an hour and 15 minutes. I'll try to keep my eye on the time with that, but wonderful. So Paul, welcome. And this energy, as you know, is at the center of nearly every global opportunity and challenge that we face today. And climate change has been really thrust into the mainstream. There's no shortage of headlines around this today. And companies and governments all across the globe, they have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, as well as continued alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the clean energy revolution of the incoming Biden administration in the United States. And, along with that, there's the European Green Deal and other global initiatives. So meeting all of these commitments implies a complete transformation of the energy system over the course of this century. But understanding what the path is to achieve that is really not easy and can be quite a bit complicated. The intermittency of renewable energy sources means that we're going to need multifaceted strategies, and including lithium-ion batteries, which are going to be a critical component to the short duration energy storage, but that comes with its own set of sustainability challenges, which we'll touch on today. But one of the answers to decarbonization comes down to developing long-term energy storage systems with the capacity to store time, and one that improves the resiliency and overall sustainability profile across all segments of the value chain. And that's where it gets pretty complicated. So the challenges are numerous, which we will discuss, but it will largely center on creating systems and policy frameworks that enable energy security, environmental and social sustainability, and of course, affordability and access. So Paul, I think it would be helpful if maybe we start off with a background of Mitsubishi Power, how you're structured, your relation to Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, and also because I think this is important too, because you all recently rebranded, and so I think that would be helpful to this conversation today.
Okay, great. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for having me, and I really look forward to this really important discussion about how we're going to decarbonize the globe. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is our parent company, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, has set a goal recently that we are going to be one of the companies that helps the world decarbonize. And we're a technology company in the heavy industry sector, and that's where a lot of the heavy lifting has to be done in terms of decarbonizing the world. So Mitsubishi Power, we did rebrand recently. We were Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems until just a few months ago. MHI acquired the shares of Hitachi. And so now, instead of being a joint venture between MHI and Hitachi power groups, we are now a wholly owned subsidiary of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. We still have all the same people, all the same factories, all the same products as we had when we were the joint venture. We're just now, solely owned by MHI. And what do? We provide power generation and storage solutions to our customers to enable them to combat climate change and advance human prosperity. And I have to tell you that, that mission statement that I just rattled off, it's actually what we do. And I wake up every morning, just really can't wait to get to work to try to accomplish such an important mission. And, we really, and I should say, our customers are the ones who are really accomplishing that mission. And we're the people who are, coming in with the technology that they need to combat climate change and advance human prosperity.
All right, excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's helpful to kind of set the stage about, what your company is all about and the role it plays in climate change and decarbonization. But, I want to digress for just a moment because we're going to be talking about hydrogen and the many forms of hydrogen. I mean, for being a colorless gas, hydrogen is referred to quite vividly across the color spectrum. And, as a former hazmat chemist, we would conduct qualitative chemical analysis in the field to determine and classify unknown materials. And we would do that using the flame test. And the color of the flame would predict the wavelength and the presence of certain metal ions. So for example, purple flame would indicate the presence of a potassium ion. However, electromagnetic radiation and Planck's constant is not what's happening here when we describe hydrogen's colors. So if you could, before we go further, because we are going to be talking about several different of the hydrogen's color spectrum, can you expound on the different variations of hydrogen's color palette?
Sure. So, most of the hydrogen that's used in the world today is what we would refer to as gray hydrogen, which means it's produced from fossil fuels. There's CO2 emissions created during the production of the hydrogen. But then, once you have the hydrogen molecule, if you combust that molecule, there's no further carbon emissions. It's just hydrogen and oxygen form water, and that's the combustion process. But what we're trying to do is to figure out how can we create hydrogen with either much lower carbon emissions or zero carbon emissions. And so the next color that people talk about is blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is still produced from fossil fuels, but we capture the CO2 emissions through carbon capture and sequestration so that it's produced with either zero carbon emissions or very low carbon emissions. So that's the blue color. The next that I think gets talked about quite a bit is green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is produced from renewable energy. And the most common way to do that is through electrolysis. So we take renewable electricity and the water molecule, we split that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. We capture that hydrogen, and now that hydrogen can be used, for whatever purpose. and there are no carbon emissions in that whole process. So it's green, totally carbon-free hydrogen. Now, another way to produce hydrogen with no carbon emissions is with nuclear power. So you use nuclear power, the same electrolysis mechanism to split the water molecule, and we call that pink hydrogen. There's another recent color called turquoise. We recently invested in a company called Monolith. Monolith uses a process to convert natural gas into hydrogen and carbon black. And so it has zero CO2 emissions because all the carbon is turned into carbon black. Carbon black is used in things like rubber, dyes, et cetera. And so it's just another way to produce a carbon-free hydrogen from methane. I think those are the major colors that I'm aware of. There's more coming out every day as new technologies emerge to create. But those are the major ones that I'm aware of.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, I think there's yellow. There's some debate about what yellow is. I mean, I've done some research on that one, and that one is, some say it's made via power or mixed origin, so a mix of renewable and fossil power that's flowing through the grid, and then white, which may be naturally occurring in geological formations. But anyway, that's awesome, Paul. Thank you for enlightening me. Yeah, I mean, there's a multitude, and so we'll be discussing a few of those today. But let's start with the big picture here. Let's start with circular economy, which is a systemic approach to economic development that's designed to benefit businesses and society and the environment. So it's a framework that leads to sustainability. And a circular economy is diametrically opposed to that take, make, waste linear business model that's prevalent today, generative by design, and it aims to gradually decouple growth from the consumption of finite resources. And the three main principles of circular economy are designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use and at economic value, and then regenerating natural systems. And so sustainability, when we look at that in relation to circular economy, it's this equilibrium of all of these factors, the social, economic, and environmental resilience. And these are some of the overarching themes that we'll be threading in today's discussion. So there's many opinions regarding circular economy's role in sustainability and how to get to that desired end state, or if it's even possible. What does circular economy mean from a sustainability perspective to Mitsubishi, and what are the challenges that industry is facing and governments as well in achieving some of these targets?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm really enjoy about my job is part of what we do is we help countries and companies and cities to actually turn those kind of words that you just spoke into reality. And I'll give you an example. So the United Kingdom has now put it into law that they will be a net zero economy by 2050. And that's an easy thing to say, probably a difficult thing to legislate, but an even more difficult thing to actually accomplish. And net zero, it doesn't mean that everything has zero emissions. It means that you still have some very difficult to decarbonize things, like perhaps aviation, that are still emitting CO2, but you're offsetting those CO2 emissions elsewhere in your economy with negative emissions. And so, we are working with a company called the Drax Group, which has the largest power plant in the country of the United Kingdom. It actually produces about 6% of the UK's electricity. And we're working with them on a strategy to have negative carbon emissions at their power plant. Now, this has been a coal-fired power plant in the past. They've converted about 2/3 of it to biomass fuel. So, the biomass comes from sustainable forestry. It's while the forest grows, it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, and and then when you combust that CO2 and you combust that biomass, it creates CO2, but it's net zero in the sense that it creates it emits the same amount of CO2 that was absorbed when you were growing the forest. But if you capture those CO2 emissions and sequester them, then you can actually be negative emissions. So you're absorbing CO2 while the forest grows, but when you combust the biomass and capture the CO2 and it doesn't go into the environment, that's a negative CO2 source. So we're working with them, and this is called bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. We're doing a pilot project. We're the world's largest carbon capture company. About 75% of the carbon capture capacity that's in operation in the world today uses MHI technology. And so we're working with them on a pilot project to demonstrate this. And then the plan is that no later than 2030, that power plant is going to be a negative carbon emissions power plant. There's another portion of it where they're going to put combined cycle gas turbines in place. And the plan is to use hydrogen to power those combined cycle gas turbines, again, eliminating carbon emissions. So that's a really exciting project. And when it's completed, that one project will actually produce 1/3 of the net or of the negative carbon emissions that the United Kingdom needs in order to meet their 2050 net zero carbon goal. So it's, the title of this thing is Decarbonization at a Global Scale. Those are the kind of things that I'm talking about. The kind of things that really move the needle. That solve 1/3 of the United Kingdom's challenge for negative carbon emissions, so that they can still have carbon emissions in some of the very difficult to decarbonize portions of their economy. Those are the kind of things our company really excels at, is going in and helping a customer with that kind of a solution, and a country with that kind of a solution.
Yeah, that's great to hear, and an important message too, right? Because it's not just going to be one technology that's going to help us decarbonize. I mean, it's going to be a variety of different technologies that are going to help us move that needle, and not just for the power sector, but a variety of different industries that are going to have to migrate into decarbonization. So more companies like Mitsubishi are moving from the standard sustainability report that demonstrates corporate social responsibility, and now recognizing how important ESG, or environmental social governance, are, and impact performance, how they could be integrated into that mainstream reporting, because now as we are on this path to become more sustainable and to decarbonize, reporting solely on financial performances of a company is no longer appropriate for a lot of decision making in corporations, or investor decision making, especially when there is increased social momentum like there is today on climate and environmental justice issues, and that has driven public attention to the importance of ESGs. And so Mitsubishi, like many businesses, you are deeply intertwined with ESG. And a strong ESG proposition creates value. And when you look at the research, it continually demonstrates that strong ESG strategies correlates with high equity returns and better performance, and it corresponds with reduction in risk. So in this sense, sustainability is an investment. So MHI is in the process of developing an index, and that index is to indicate sustainable and balanced targets, specifically around energy infrastructure. What are some of the distinguishing features of this new index that you're developing?
Yeah, so one of the things that's a challenge as a global company is, as we work around the world, different parts of the world are developing different ways of measuring sustainability and ESG. And so one of the things we're doing is we're trying to work on a standardized way of quantifying the ESG characteristics of an energy infrastructure project. And we're calling this Quan, which has a strange spelling. It's capital Q, small o, capital E, small n. And it sort of stands for the quality of energy. It's grounded in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And what it attempts to do is, in a world in the past where the way we measured an energy project was often, something like IRR, investment or return on investment, we're trying to expand that to really have three axes of measurement. One is still economic, but there's an environmental axis and there's a social axis as well. And so in addition to measuring the financial performance of a project, we want to measure, what's its impact on the environment, things like carbon emissions, how much renewable power is involved, those sorts of metrics. And then also social things. So what's the impact on health? What's the impact on education? And really, again, it's grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has agreed upon. So we're working with the University of South Wales in Australia to develop this index, and we're starting to apply it now on energy projects around the world. And again, with the idea that we can develop some standardized way of having a metrics and numbers that we can show that a future energy project or energy infrastructure project, how it's impacting all three of those axes of sustainable development.
So Paul, the index that you're referring to, it's centered on a project at an area level or a regional level, and then so how is that translated and expanded to, the corporate level and across supply chains?
Right. So, the really interesting thing is that you have to actually get down to the city level with this sort of a thing, because in different parts of the world, those, their priorities along those three axes are different, and justifiably so. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, your focus on those three axes is different than it might be in San Francisco, for example. And so what we're doing is we're going in with, city leadership and getting their assessment on, where do they want to land on the economic axis, the environmental axis, and the social axis. And then that gives us a framework for that city to measure any future energy infrastructure project in terms of, is it contributing to meeting the goals of that particular city or that particular region that they've set for themselves in terms of meeting sustainable development goals. It's just a fascinating thing to me. One of the things I tell people all the time is, an energy solution that's exactly right for, Hamburg, Germany, is not necessarily what's exactly right for, Cairo, Egypt. It's just there's different challenges around the world, and also different access to fuels. There's different social issues. And so we really need to have something that we can tailor to different parts of the world, but always grounded in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, and I really like that you're saying that, because I think oftentimes when we look at solutions, we have a very OECD-centric and developed world perspective that our solutions here are transposable in other economies, which are not. And I see that a lot with the work I do with plastics and the plastic waste issue, and looking across the entire value chain and across the world on what are these workable solutions, and they're not all one size fits all approach. So it sounds like this new index that you have is to do just that, is to look at some of the local solutions and how they apply and some of the impacts there. But I think given the lack of ESG standardization around definitions, metrics, and reporting and benchmarking across in industry. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because there isn't really a whole lot of standardization. But being a multinational company with presence in dozens of countries where, you know, as you just said, there's different cultures and economics and legalities. And all of these can lead to ESG disparities at the country level, at the industry level, and at the corporate level. And it's hard enough to draw comparisons and create consistencies, you know, within a company and you know, much less, you know, entire industry. How do you integrate consistent ESGs in multiple countries and even within the same business line?
Well, keep in mind, you know, we are really a servant to our customers. And so it's really our customers who drive that integration. What we try to do is give them the tools that allow them to do that. And again, you know, when I talked about my mission statement earlier before, I said, you know, we're empowering our customers to combat climate change and advance human prosperity. We really feel like our customers are the heroes in that equation. And when, you know, it's our job to enable them. And so things like the Quan index is really a tool that we're trying to give to our customers to help them solve that integration problem. And again, being a multinational company, you know, you recognize that, you know, if you think you know the right answer in such a complex world that our customers are dealing in, you know, I learn something every time I go meet with a customer. They understand their own local issues to a much greater extent than I or my company ever will. So it's really their job to solve the integration problem. It's our job to give them the tools they need and the technology they need to solve those or to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend this whole time talking about ESG because I could, but you know, with the pandemic that recently happened, I mean, I mean, by and large, stocks of companies with strong ESG credentials, they've proven a safer haven in periods of market disruption like the pandemic. And I think, you know, the pandemic could elevate ESG factors because investors are expressing more concerns about supply chain management and other priorities. And I think the evolution of ESG investing is going to accelerate, especially under the new Biden administration in the United States, where there's going to be more of a push for an overhauled corporate governance standards and creating mandatory disclosure requirements. And so I think there's going to be a need for some type of standardization and investment criteria. And so with everything that's happened across the world and going through this pandemic, which has exposed a lot of disruptions and supply chains, both upstream and downstream, has there been a retooling or reconsideration on your end of ESG criteria and the metrics, given some of the disruptions and other issues the pandemic has exposed?
You know, I really don't think the pandemic has changed the long-term, you know, goals. You know, the United Nations set the 2030 targets. I feel like we're still, you know, the targets are the same. I will say, though, 2020 has been a year of change in the energy industry that has just been absolutely amazing to me. And I'll just give you one example. You know, in the United States, in 2019, our total orders for energy storage, grand total for our company, was 0. And in 2019, our company's orders for energy storage are about $1 billion. So in 1 year, storage in the United States went from, you know, hardly anything to a really major part of our, you know, our business. And it's about half of that $1 billion is in lithium-ion battery storage. The other half is in hydrogen production and storage. And I would have never dreamt that it could have happened that fast. So something has changed in 2020. And I do think the global pandemic perhaps is behind it, in the sense that everybody saw so much change so fast as a result of the COVID virus. You know, like things like we're doing right now. You know, my admin at work was out on medical leave in the first part of the pandemic. And when she came back to work, I had to sort of explain to her that we don't do phone calls anymore. We do, you know, we do WebEx and we do Zoom and we do Microsoft Teams. Right. Nobody calls anybody anymore. I mean, and that's just that. And, you know, that happened while he was out on medical leave. And so we've seen so many things change so rapidly. I think people are seeing that things can change even faster in the energy industry than maybe everybody thought they could. And so things like energy storage are, really blossoming right now. The other thing with the energy storage equation, though, is, we didn't really need a lot of energy storage until about now. And the reason we need it now is because places like California and Texas are so heavily penetrated with renewables that, they're starting to have negative power pricing, duck curve issues, curtailments. Those are clear market signals that we need energy storage. And so that, that's maybe the impetus behind it. But the rapid change that's occurred, I think everybody's just in a sort of a rapid change mindset, in part because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and we'll get back to that discussion on storage. And yeah, I mean, and it's an interesting one, but and now with the hydrogen economy and with numerous false starts, it feels like it's finally, arriving. I mean, obviously it's in an embryonic stage, but hydrogen is seen as a priority area for clean and circular economy. And there seems to be this palpable convergence to diversify the energy portfolio from all actors across the value chain, which is creating an inflection point in climate discussions. And it's seen as this game changer for achieving decarbonization, especially in hard to abate sectors like the transportation sector and manufacturing. And with all of the renewables that are coming online and the challenges in intermittency and energy curtailment when power is in excess, hydrogen is really a grid balancer and a seasonal storage solution, and it can help improve air quality and strengthen energy security. So in this sense, it's critical to the circular economy. I want to get your thoughts on where you see the United States in this process, because when you look across the globe, and you've worked in all parts and corners of the world, there's over 50 mandates right now and different policy initiatives to support hydrogen. And 11 countries across G20 and EU have policies in place. And 9 of them have national roadmaps for hydrogen energy, and several have national circular economy frameworks. And when you look at EU, they're pushing ahead aggressively in this area, as are some other countries. So where do you see the United States in this process?
Yeah, one thing that's always interested me about the U.S. is, we've never really had an energy policy in the U.S. Things tend to happen more due to markets and technology, and a little bit less due to, and also sort of state level government decisions. And it's driven a little bit less by the federal government, whereas in other parts of the world, I think, federal energy policy has a bigger impact. But if you look at what's happened in the U.S. in the last 2 decades, we've decarbonized the power sector by 40% since the year 2000. I think a lot of people don't even know that, but 40% less carbon emissions from the production of electricity than we had 20 years ago. And the reason for that is we've been retiring coal-fired power generation and replacing it with a combination of natural gas and renewables. Natural gas produces about 65% less CO2 emissions than coal-fired power generation. Renewables are carbon-free. If you have like a 50-50 mix of those, which is sort of what's been happening, then that's about an 85% reduction every time you retire a coal-fired power plant and replace it with a combination of natural gas and renewables. Now, why did that happen? Well, part of the push on renewables was state-level renewable portfolio standards. Part of the push was, the federal investment tax credit and production tax credit. But when you look at natural gas, it was really, technology that caused it's a lot cheaper to produce power from natural gas now than it is from coal, because of new gas drilling technologies, and also because we and our competitors have really improved the technology in gas turbines over these last 20 years. So, and even on the side of wind and solar, yes, there's been renewable portfolio standards, investment tax credits that help start things off. But what's really driving them in the United States right now is it's cheaper to produce electricity from wind and solar than it is from coal. And so that's what's driving it. Now, what's interesting, though, in the U.S. is we have some places like California is a great example. California is about to retire the last coal-fired power plant that is producing power for the state of California. So what I just described as retiring coal and replacing it with a combination of natural gas and renewables has run its course in California. And so you have to ask yourself, is California going to continue to decarbonize their power sector? The answer is absolutely yes. And if they are, then how are they going to do that? And the only remaining fossil fuel to take out of that equation is natural gas. So California is going to have to start using less natural gas. And we believe what they're going to replace it with is a combination of renewables and energy storage. And this is why storage has really jumped to the forefront here in 2020, is because a lot of parts of the United States are entering this second phase of decarbonization, where we're going to be using less natural gas and replacing it with a combination of renewables and storage. Now, what's happening with storage? In California, right now, it's a lot of 4-hour battery energy storage, lithium-ion battery storage, where there's a lot of PV solar going in California, and they need to peak shift from the midday to the early evening when they have the maximum demand. In places like ERCOT in Texas, there's a lot of new wind on the grid in Texas. And so in Texas, they're looking more for like 1-hour battery storage with fast frequency response that can help regulate frequency as wind sort of goes up and down throughout the entire day. And then on the hydrogen side, where we're seeing demand for hydrogen is utilities that have set a net zero goal for 2045 or 2050, and who are recognizing that, yes, battery storage is going to be very important to getting there, but battery storage really only solves their short duration storage challenge. The longer duration, when you have to store power for a day or for a week or for a month or from season to season, lithium ion is prohibitively expensive for those longer time periods. And even if it achieves massive cost reduction, it's not enough. That's where they're looking at a solution like hydrogen to store renewable power for really long periods of time to meet that long duration storage challenge. So, I mentioned California is about to retire their last coal-fired power plant. It's called the Intermountain Power Plant. It's actually in Delta, Utah, but it's connected into the Los Angeles basin by a HVDC line. And most of its power goes into the state of California. So they've announced they're going to retire the Intermountain Power Plant in 2025. And we were selected to provide gas turbines that are going to repower that power plant. But instead of using natural gas, we're going to use gas turbines that are capable of using green hydrogen. And so when they go into commercial operation at 2025, they're going to start using 30% hydrogen. And then we've committed that over time, we're going to be able to increase that to 100% hydrogen, so that the California can meet their 2045 net zero goal. So this is another example where we're going in, working with at the state level, also at the city of Los Angeles level, also with the utility Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and trying to provide them sort of a total solution that allows them to meet their net zero goal. Now, so why is hydrogen starting there? Well, the answer
and Paul, with that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to ask about that particular project, the Intermountain Power Project. The all 100% hydrogen and storage. I mean, so is the plan to eventually build pipelines from the salt domes?
Yeah, so what's unique about Intermountain Power is it sits right on top of a really large salt dome. And so the reason hydrogen's coming first to Intermountain Power is just they're sitting right on top of the underground infrastructure that they need. and they don't need a pipeline to get from a salt dome to their power plant. And so we're actually developing a project with a partner called Magnum to store and to produce green hydrogen on site and store that green hydrogen in that salt dome. The hydrogen will be produced using excess renewable power from California and other local areas. And it's because it's right underneath that power plant, we don't have to build a pipeline to get it there. But we're also working with other utilities in the Western United States, and we're talking to them about doing a similar project, for example, say in Butte, Montana, where we would use water in Butte to produce hydrogen using electrolysis. And then we'd connect them by a pipeline to that salt dome in Delta, Utah, so that they can store green hydrogen when they have excess renewables, and then bring that hydrogen back to their power plant when they're short on renewables. And it's really meant to solve the kind of problem that California just had this summer. So California in the springtime has massive curtailment of renewable power. They produce more renewable power than they need at the moment. And so they have to tell renewable power producers, stop producing power. It's too much. What we'd like to do is let them continue to produce that power, convert it into hydrogen, store it in the springtime. And then, we just saw that California came up short on power this summer. They happened to have a, very hot day in the whole region, and the whole region came up short on power. And California actually had to have, rolling blackouts because they just didn't have enough electricity to meet their needs. That would be exactly the time that we'd take that excess renewable power from the spring that we had converted into hydrogen, and we would use it in the summertime when the power production from renewables doesn't meet the instantaneous demand of the power grid.
Paul, a question about I guess this overall process, because like turbines, the electrolyzers that are used, they're most efficient and economical when they're consistently running near full capacity. But it might not be possible to produce significant amounts of hydrogen using exclusively cheap or curtailed electricity if those electrolyzers operate on, maybe only 10% of the time or less. So in emerging markets that only have occasional availability of this curtailed electricity, how do you ensure that those electrolyzers have high utilization rates so that the hydrogen production costs are lowered?
Yeah. So let's start with just a simple fact. If you don't have a lot of renewables on your power grid, you don't need storage. So unless you're actually creating a lot of curtailed electricity, you don't need green hydrogen. You don't need lithium-ion batteries. And that's why up until now, we haven't done a lot of storage, because even in places like California, that, as they've been building up their renewable capacity, it hasn't gotten to a point where they've had this massive curtailment problem until very recently. So the market signal that you need storage is that you've put so much renewables on your grid that you're now starting to have issues like curtailment. So you don't need storage unless you have a lot of excess curtailed electricity. And right now in California, you're absolutely right. There's not enough curtailed electricity to get our electrolyzers to the capacity factor that makes economic sense. And so in the beginning, we're going to have some dedicated renewable power that that is just used to drive the electrolyzers. But you have to think into the future. If California's at 40% renewables today, as they go to 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, the availability of curtailed electricity is going to increase dramatically. And so more and more of the electricity that we use in the electrolyzers over time is going to be curtailed electricity that's going to be very low cost or even negative cost. And we'll use less and less of that dedicated renewable power to power the electrolyzers. So, and we know how to do the math on that kind of thing, and sort of, discounting future cash flows and all that sort of thing. And that's part of sort of the economics of making green hydrogen work, is sort of forecasting into the future when you have super high renewables penetration and a really, huge abundance of curtailed electricity.
Yeah, time here, because I know we've got a ton of questions that are pouring in, but I still want to talk about some of the challenges the hydrogen industry will encounter, and one of those is water. Saying green hydrogen, the availability of water resources are going to undoubtedly encounter challenges, predominantly in facility siting, since water is used as a feedstock and the electrolyzers to create the hydrogen. So understanding where and how the necessary amounts of water will be available is going to be critical, as well understanding the administrative regimes that govern water use and water rights and jurisdiction. Because the availability of water, along with water management and water treatment, could be a factor in hydrogen success over the long run, especially in areas where there's water scarcity. And we know that water scarcity affects 40% of the world's population. So how do you balance that? I mean, what are you guys looking at in the planning as far as the resource demand for this? Has there been a prospective, maybe life cycle assessment on water usage?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, whatever water we use, when we convert it back into electricity, we create water again, and so there is sort of a circularity there in terms of every water molecule we consume to produce hydrogen gets turned back into a water molecule. But this issue of water availability, one of the things we're doing, for example, in our U.S. projects, is we're siting them where we used to have a coal-fired power plant. A coal-fired power plant uses a lot of water and has a lot of water rights. So that Intermountain Power Project has very substantial water rights. We're going to use a very small fraction of the water that used to be used to cool the coal-fired power plants in order to produce hydrogen. And then we're also looking at other places in the West. For example, the reason I talked about Butte, Montana before, there's a Superfund site in Butte where an old coal mine that's like over a mile deep has been filling up with rainwater over a long period of time. And it's now to the point where it's exceeding the capacity of that reservoir to hold that water. The water has a lot of contaminants in it. And so we're looking at, actually solving that Superfund problem by using that water, cleaning it up, and then using that in our electrolysis equipment. So not only do we produce green hydrogen to help solve climate change, but we're also helping deal with this Superfund cleanup issue where they've got excess water accumulating and they're not sure what to do with it. I mean, that's just one example, but certainly water is part of the equation. And I mean, we sort of have a joke in the industry that where you site power projects is where a pipeline crosses a power line. When it comes to green hydrogen, the other part of that equation is you need to make sure that you've got water availability. But we've now looked at a number of different sites in the southwestern United States, the northwestern United States, and other areas. And we're confident that in most places we can solve that problem. And then in places where you can't solve that problem, then you either bring hydrogen in that's produced somewhere else through a pipeline, or you use electrical transmission to transmit electricity to that location to solve their water scarcity issue. And this, we can apply the same.
Yeah, well, I know the Supreme. Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to watch. I know the Supreme Court is set to hear arguments on a number of different cases that involve interstate water rights, and so I think this will be precedent setting and could impact the hydrogen production in the on those things. And there's a whole lot of other challenges, as you were talking about the transportation, storage, and distribution that I really would love to touch on, because that's really my wheelhouse. But we're pushing up against 10 o'clock right now, and I do want to touch on a big in that, like your thoughts on, because in order to get to disposal of green technologies and reusability, and Mitsubishi Power offers. You talked about lithium-ion battery, and you all offer solutions either as an individual product or as a part of a larger integrated energy storage solution. And so you're all building utility scale battery energy storage systems all over the world, and you mentioned a little bit ago that last year you had 0 orders, and then this year over almost $1 billion. And there's going to be, I'm sure, multiples of that in the following years. And you guys are set to have the #1 market shares in all durations of energy storage. And you've also launched a new division on renewable power development focused on solar PVs. And so that's all incredible and wildly exciting. But as someone who's spent much of their career saturated in waste management issues for various industries all across the globe, the potential waste volumes at the end of life is a bit staggering, especially from a sustainability and circular economy perspective. And so I just wanted to briefly discuss with you how you all are rethinking and incorporating end-of-life management into your products and your services.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you one example. Lithium-ion batteries, their requirements in the transportation application are much higher than in the power application. And so one of the things we're really working hard on right now is we're working with companies who are using lithium-ion batteries in transportation, and we want to buy those batteries from them when they're at the end of their lifetime for transportation and use them for power applications where the remaining capabilities of that battery still meet our requirements to store renewable power. And therefore we can give those batteries a second life. That's one example of the kind of thing that we are working on to try to help resolve that sort of end of life issue in the lithium ion space. Because a lithium ion battery actually has a lot of really valuable materials in it, and so if you can give it a second life, not only is it going to help the transportation industry by having a residual value for that battery, but it's also going to help the power industry by having a much lower cost source of lithium-ion batteries. But Rachel, it's early days, and there's still a lot of work to be done on, what we're going to be doing with wind farms at the end of life, with PV solar panels at the end of life, and lithium-ion batteries, at the end of their first life or their second life. There's still, an endpoint there. And so recycling of those clean energy technologies is ultimately going to be what we have to figure out, and that's something that is a big to-do for our industry.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think there's a lot to understand regarding the safety and design standards for batteries and other clean energy technologies that are being used not for their intended purpose. What are the second life standards for usability, and do they require safety and performance testing protocols to ensure that the battery management systems are compatible with deployment of an aged asset? Especially for those that are moving into new applications. And how does the recycled or recovered materials affect performance, reliability, and all of those things? And so I think there's a lot to be done on the policy side, because federal requirements when it comes to lithium-ion batteries, they were promulgated decades ago, and they didn't contemplate the disposal of significant quantities of these batteries. And so I think there's a lot to look at when it comes to classification and storage, packing, transportation, and end of life. But like you said, a lot of these lack a stable market for collection, transportation, recycling, and a lot of state and federal requirements are non-existent. And if they are, they're very inconsistent and not clear to market participants. And so there's so much uncertainty along all of this, and a lot of work a lot of work to be done. And so, as a global economy that's striving for a circular economy, how do we ensure that these technologies that we're developing and the policies that are supposed to shepherd these along, how do we make sure that they're keeping pace with innovations and solutions, both at the beginning of the life cycle and the end of the life? And I guess that's, you don't really have to answer that unless you want to. I mean, it's kind of it's an overarching question that the entire industry, has to figure out, because, if sustainability and accelerating the energy transition are in fact a priority, then we really need to understand all the different vulnerabilities and liabilities, all across the board.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say.
So I think, Paul, I think I want to move into. Go ahead.
Well, just very quickly, one thing to realize about capitalism is, the saying in our industry when you're developing new products is being early is just as bad as being wrong, right? So if you develop a product that the world doesn't need or doesn't need yet, you've really wasted your money because nobody's going to buy it. So things like, dealing with end-of-life issues on new technologies like renewable power or battery storage, it's a real problem for the future, but nobody has sort of invested in solving that problem yet, just because it's a problem for the future. I do think that if government puts sensible policies in place that are going to require an end-of-use technical solution, companies like ours and others will make the investments to do it. But, we're not going to invest in something that, in a product that the world doesn't need now. We're going to try to invest in a product so that it's available when the world needs it.
Well, and I think that's where the circular economy principles challenges those thoughts. It challenges us to think of things holistically from the beginning of life to the end of life. When I look at, I do a lot of research in the global plastic waste issue, and it's so extensive that we need now intervention from every angle. And plastics have become so complex that you can't even manage them at the end of the life, and policies and technologies have significantly lagged since the 1950s. And so now, I'm seeing this in the e-waste side of things, and also with the clean energy revolution now. And the catalyst to this has been the pandemic and China's import ban, which is forcing us to think about end of life. And so I see this playing out in industries, and I'll give you a quick example, and it's the e-waste industry, and I see that happening with lithium-ion batteries. But we used to have CRTs, the old tube TVs that had lead, and we migrated to LCD flat screens, but they contain mercury, and then we quickly moved to LEDs. And although they were mercury-free, they contained, lead, nickel, silver, copper, all things that we had to figure out how to manage at the end of the life. And now we're moving over to quantum dots that contain cadmium nanoparticles, and that's a whole nother safety issue. And so end-of-life technologies and regulatory frameworks, they can't keep up with rapid development and employment. And this is a real problem when you look at things at the end of life. So the market really is not keeping pace. And so I think there needs to be some type of motivation, whether that's some kind of federal intervention, to really start concatenating the upstream technology and innovations with the downstream side, because we do have such deficient policies. And so, I guess that I want to ask you something, along that line. So knowing that there's a lack of skilled recycling technology at the end of life for low carbon or zero emission innovations, and deficient policies to systematically manage the waste, and no real mechanism to capture metrics throughout the value chain, including the mining, processing, trade, export, all of those things. Should we wait to accelerate the energy transition until we have more robust frameworks for these? Or I guess you kind of answered that. Saying you're more of a true capitalist and leaving it to market forces. But is this something that companies should have an awareness of?
For sure. So we certainly can't slow down the clean energy economy just because the the math on climate change is pretty clear at this point that, we have an urgent need to do something right now. But I absolutely agree with you that we have to solve this end of life issue for clean energy technologies. And the only point I'm making is just companies like ours and others, we will come up with solutions if we believe there's a market there. And so that gets back to your point. We do need governments around the world to take a look at this issue and, again, put together sensible policies that are going to make it clear that there's going to be an opportunity to have an industry that does these kind of things. And if you invest in products that will be able to recycle these and reuse them, that it's an investment that's going to have a return to it. And that's why I made my capitalist comment. And believe me, I'm on a mission to decarbonize power and help solve climate change and advance human prosperity. But at the same time, we can't. I mean, we have to make a profit in order to stay in business. And so we're a mission-driven company, but we're also a company that recognizes that the economics need to work in order for us to achieve our mission.
Right. Okay, I want to move, Paul, into some of the Q&A, and one of the questions is whether or not nuclear plants will be necessary for large-scale decarbonization, and not only to supply the baseload power, but also to make green hydrogen. And I think you mentioned that there is a project that you're all working on, or several.
Yeah, so we are one of the few companies in the world that provides nuclear power technology. It's a very substantial business for us. And, we certainly believe that some of the new technologies like small modular reactors have a lot of promise, and we're investing in them. The challenge with nuclear right now is there's been so many instances where we've had cost overruns in, not us, but I mean the industry has had cost overruns in some very visible projects that a lot of our customers and also a lot of the investors and lenders to those kind of projects, they look at them and say, even a huge utility doesn't have the balance sheet to go into a project that starts out at $10 billion and ends up at $20 billion. And so that's why we're starting to look at smaller modular reactors, where instead of a $20 billion risk, you can take a more manageable, $2 billion or $5 billion risk, and still get the benefits of nuclear power. Because where nuclear really does have a huge advantage is, one, of course, it's carbon free. But two, it doesn't have the intermittency challenge, so it can be part of your sort of baseload carbon-free resources, and can be used, to increase the capacity factor of electrolysis, for example, by being a steady supply of low-cost electricity to produce green hydrogen for other uses. So we think it has a place, but I have to say the politics of nuclear are also very complicated. And of course, there's a huge end of life issue with nuclear waste, which really hasn't been properly addressed in the U.S. and some other places. So all those complications are really what is, I would say, hindering nuclear, combined with the fact that renewables and storage, if you believe the cost trajectories for not just for renewables, but for lithium-ion batteries and for hydrogen, could be a lower cost solution than nuclear without all of that risk I just mentioned.
How does sustaining of the nuclear and the coal industries complicate the understanding of where markets are going and the planning of a hydrogen economy?
Yeah, anytime that governments sort of disrupt normal operation of power markets, it really does, complicate decision making. So, for example, there's been some high profile things in the U.S. where governments have subsidized coal and nuclear. Usually the reason given for the subsidy is to protect jobs. When you look at the amount of the subsidy per job saved, it's usually a number that's sort of extraordinary. We feel like governments are doing the best for the economy and for jobs and for the environment when they set sensible policies and then let markets and technology work. Any form of subsidy is really sort of interfering with the normal functioning of markets. So we just need to be careful that when we do provide subsidies, that we're doing it, for the kind of things that are taking us in the direction of achieving these sustainable development goals. It sort of gets back to that Quan index that I was talking about. When we're subsidizing things that are sort of going in the wrong direction from those sustainable development goals, that's a market disruption that I think it really has a negative impact. On the other hand, when we're subsidizing things that are taking us in the direction we want to go, I think that's a positive impact.
Rachel, hey, Paul, I'm going to jump in. I think we might have lost Rachel. Okay. Starting with technical difficulties and getting near the end with more technical difficulties. But I have a question that I just want to throw out there related to the index, because I actually think that's fascinating, and it's actually related to interesting enough, a diagram that is on the whiteboard in my office that everybody comments on when they come in terms of achieving various objectives and the trade-offs that are necessary oftentimes in doing so. And when you build such an index and realize that you're trying to adhere to the sustainable development goals laid out by the UN and achieve various commerciality, but also social and environmental goals. There's a strong ESG overlay there. And there's a lot of movement in the financial community to really quantify ESG metrics. I wonder if you could comment just real briefly on how the index that you've developed sort of overlays with some of those efforts and where you think those might go.
Yeah, we think there's a really strong synergy between what a lot of financial investors are trying to achieve. A lot of private equity funds and pension funds and other things that are really important investors in infrastructure projects. Their investors and their stakeholders are requiring them to show that they're doing things that are in line with SDG kind of initiatives. And so it's really, I tell you, it's had an amazing impact on our industry. The cost of money to do a renewable project is dramatically lower today than the cost of money to do a fossil fuel project, just for example, just because there's many more people that want to put dollars at work to do green things than there are people who want to put dollars at work to do other things. But they're all, one of the difficulties is, how do you tell your limited partners, if you're the general partner in a fund, how do you convince them that, you're doing what they want you to do? Well, we think that something like this Quan index that we've developed is one of the ways that you can do that. And you can, because, and again, in different parts of the world, it's a totally different equation. Just, for example, the country of Japan doesn't have a lot of its own resources, including renewable power. There's not a lot of flat land in Japan so you have to go offshore if you're going to do wind, for example. And PV solar, you need to go on a rooftop. And whereas in the desert southwest of the United States, there's miles and miles of flat land that's just waiting for a solar panel. Probably overstating the simplicity of it, but in different parts of the world, the equation's just totally different. And so, but if you've got an index like this that allows you to compare an infrastructure project in one part of the world to an infrastructure project in another part of the world in a using an index that everybody recognizes, then you can go back to your limited partners and show them, hey, we agreed, we all agreed we're going to use this index. This particular project has some uniqueness to it, which is hard to quantify or hard to describe. But if we quantify it on this index we've all agreed to, it's accomplishing so much good and the social index, so much good on the environmental index, then maybe we'll accept a lower financial return on this one. On the other hand, maybe another project that's not making so much progress on those other two axes, you're going to require a much better, a much higher return on. I really think those, that could be a big help. And by the way, again, I just want to emphasize for people listening who might not be as close to this as I am on what's sort of happening right now. Private investors right now are having a big impact on our industry. So it's not just governments that we need to take certain actions. In a lot of places, and the U.S. is a good example, it's actually investors that are driving things today almost as much as it is state or local or federal governments. And it's a really powerful new dynamic. The other quick thing I'll just say is, we've got customers now like Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon who are saying, we don't just want net zero, we want zero. We want every electron we consume in the instant that we consume it to be 100% green. We're not going to, do what we've done in the past, which is to buy the same amount of green power that we consume, but it may not have been produced at the same time we consume it. Those companies, private companies like those, are driving the need for storage today in as impactful of a way as governments are.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's actually something that's coming out in a lot of the work that we've been doing as well. And I've sort of long emphasized the role of the principle of comparative advantage in terms of determining the course to achieving decarbonization in different regions. And I think what you've laid out, particularly with the index that you've highlighted and the efforts that MHI is involved in, really does speak to that. Because you're right. I mean, the solution in one part of the world won't necessarily be the solution in the other. And it is interesting as well to see how capital markets are really influencing those decision-making processes, because without a doubt, ESG metrics have entered into the discussion in a much more substantial way than they ever have before. You commented earlier that COVID-19, the year of the pandemic, has sort of signaled some things with regard to that. And I think that's true. And it's going to be interesting to see how that momentum continues going forward, particularly as governments begin to try to pick up the mantle and sort of leverage what private investors are indicating they want, and consumers, for that matter, indicating what they want. So it's a fascinating time. And I think in general, everything you've laid out, it fits very nicely under the mantle of the title of this webinar, right? Which is Decarbonization on Global Scale, Challenges and Opportunities. Because I think to really capture opportunity, you have to recognize challenges. And I think you've done a really good job of highlighting that today. So thank you. Go ahead.
I know we're coming to the end of our time. One thing, I've been watching the Q&As coming in on the chat box, and I think because of some of the technical difficulties, we didn't get around to answering some of those questions. I'm a very active LinkedIn user, so if anybody wants to send their question to me through LinkedIn, I'd be happy to respond. And so it's I'm Paul Browning, Mitsubishi. I think you can use that to find me through LinkedIn. This is something I'm really passionate about, and I'm really proud to be working for a company that is focused on, such a fundamental issue of decarbonization at global scale. And like I said, we really are a mission-driven company and really committed to this mission.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Paul. I was actually going to comment on that as we close. We actually do capture all the questions, and for those of you who have questions we didn't get to, I think a lot of the discussion that you and Rachel had did weave through some of those topics very nicely, because I've been watching it too. But we will definitely get back to you. And by all means, feel free to reach out to Paul directly via LinkedIn. He offered it up, so I would take him up on it. But we will certainly respond in kind with answers to those questions. And you're right, Paul, we are up against it. If you have anything additional you want to throw out onto the floor just in closing, that'd be a good time to do it.
Well, I just want to thank you guys for hosting this. Rice University, I think, is one of the premier educational institutions here in the United States. And, it's great that you guys are providing this kind of a venue for companies like us to come in and tell our story. And again, I'm just proud to be one of the people at MHI who's trying to make this happen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And you're right. It's great to hear from people who are on the front lines and dealing with this, because not only is it educational, but it's in many ways enlightening beyond just what you would get sort of by reading up on something. So fantastic discussion today. Thank you from both myself and Rachel, who unfortunately is having technical difficulties and can't help us sign off. But everybody, thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next time. In the meantime, stay safe and stay healthy.